All right. Let's just give this just one more minute and we'll get started. Yeah, 26 people. Great, 25.
Hi, Efren.
Hi, Jim. Nice to see you.
See you.
Okay. Well, in the interest of time, it is 6 p.m. and we've got a lot to cover. And I see folks from all over the country. I'm very, very excited. I know that we have a lot of returning happy customers and a lot of new ones, and that really thrills me. Sometimes they talk about word of mouth, and you kind of go, yeah, whatever. I mean, isn't advertising better? But I have to say that thanks to all of you, word of mouth really has worked, and I'm just thrilled to welcome so many people that said, so-and-so told me about this. And I want to specifically thank Meryl Meisler, who I see there with her camera, because she specifically reached out to the Professional Women Photographers Network. And so many of you said, I want to be part of this. So I want to welcome you specifically because many of you came forward and I really appreciate that. Plus, having actual photographers on the call kind of makes things even more interesting, right? It's like you guys can tell us about, what you do with street photography and whether I'm completely off base. So let's get started. As you know, what I do is I start sharing my screen. And when I do that, I want you to go to a section. Let's go ahead and do that. You're going to go to a place on the top that says viewing options. And one of the things that you can do is you can choose to do side-by-side viewing. So that way, those nice little faces of people aren't blocking half of the image. And you can just have the image on the left and me or people on the right. So let me know if you can give me a thumbs up, if you can hear me, and make sure that you can see my screen. That'll be really helpful. I'm looking at Sandy. Sandy, can you give me a thumbs up? Okay. Thank you, Sandy. So let's get started. As you know, I've been giving these talks on photography for most of last year during the COVID lockdown and now this year. And I just love the feedback I'm getting. I hope that this one lives up to those standards. We're going to be talking about street photography. And it's a really fascinating topic, first of all, because it's so huge and so broad that, believe me when I say, that's why I had to do it in at least 2 parts. So as you will see, we were initially going to just do tonight street photography. As I got into it and I got really enthralled and I saw the number of artists and the number of issues, I thought, well, forget that. I'm not doing that in one talk. So tonight we'll focus on photography on the streets very early on and into a movement, not a movement, but precursors in Paris in the 1930s that you could say were some of the first people really going out and doing street photography. And then we'll go up to the era of the 1960s that almost becomes kind of a golden era of street photography in post-war US. And then in 2 weeks, I hope you come back, we will continue that golden era because it's so rich in terms of what went on. And then we will start looking really at artists that had been doing this worldwide, whether it's in Greece, in Mexico, in the UK and elsewhere, and then acknowledge that the reality is this is an ongoing global movement. There's a lot of you that said, I do street photography, I do it in 2021. So to start off, I thought we'd have fun with this little bit of a quiz. I placed these 4 images up on the screen, and I want you to look at them and think about which one you think is really street photography. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about that. Okay. Well, let's think about this. You see, when we talk about street photography tonight, we're going to differentiate between photography on streets and street photography with a capital S and a capital P. And the reason for that is because street photography is really an artistic movement. And I've just taken a couple of bullets of what generally describes the movement of street photography. One of the things is it captures the mystery and aura of streets and public spaces. So it's not always going to be on the street, but it is going to be somewhere public. Human beings are key. It tends to be, not always, but it tends to be spontaneous. It's about capturing some moment or maybe a person that would otherwise have gone unnoticed. And this is really important. In the street photography with a capital S and capital P, the idea is that this is not photography with some kind of mission, you know, like a documentary mission or photojournalism. And as we'll talk about, really all of this was a result of some amazing advances in camera technology. So let's talk about the quiz. Let's see what you thought. I'm not going to be a purist tonight about, you know, this is in, that's out. But when we think, oh my, why am I drawing on, well, anyway, I don't know what that is. When we look at these images, is someone drawing on the screen? That's very strange. But anyway, on the left, Bernice Abbott, we'll talk a bit about her, documented the landscapes of changing New York. If you look at that Brooklyn Bridge, there are no people in it. So it's not that interesting from a human standpoint. On the bottom left, Jill Friedman inserted herself into a campaign, the Poor People's Campaign in Washington in 1968. And she documented in DC the plight of these people that basically camped out. So there was very much a documentary mission. If you look at Linda Evangelista looking fabulous with her cigarette, well, that's for a very well planned photo shoot for Vogue magazine. So yes, it's a human, but there's not much spontaneity about it. It's basically, she probably made a lot of money and planned it weeks ahead. So up on the right, this convertible, this Broadway convertible fits the needs of what we're talking about, because Louis Forer here captured, no, sorry, I'm so sorry, I changed my photo. Gary Winogrand, as we will discuss, captured this really strange, spontaneous moment that almost looks like an accident is about to happen. We'll talk about him extensively. But in this talk, to understand why this movement is unique and important, I thought we should go way back, because to understand why this was unique, we have to go back to all the challenges that existed way back in the early days of the medium. Well, here I have a picture of Julia Margaret Cameron's camera. How spontaneous can you be with that, right? And people back then didn't have 35mm film or negatives. They used big glass plates that they had to coat with collodion. So again, very bulky, very heavy. And if they dried, you were done. Long exposure times. I don't know if you've ever seen in the studios, they have these contraptions where people's neck had to be held up because it could take minutes and minutes and minutes before you got their image. So imagine going in the street, you're trying to take a picture and a horse-drawn carriage goes by. That's the end of your photograph, right? Because you were trying to get this perfect image and now it's been ruined. And of course, early on, there was dependence on daylight. There was no electricity and no flashes. So, you know, nighttime photography, and some of you may have been to the talk Creatures of the Night, that was even harder. So let's talk about what Charles Nègre did in the mid-19th century. I think this is really interesting because he captures these chimney sweeps going by, but you know what? It's not so spontaneous. Again, think about the exposure times and think about the size of his camera. He found these men. He lived on the beautiful Ile de Saint-Louis in the middle of Paris. He had a studio. He told these men and this boy, please stand there, put your little foot forward, make it look like you're walking. And by the way, this probably took minutes. And this was a great example of trying to capture motion, but obviously in a very contrived way, right? Because this is totally posed. One of the first people that really wandered around the streets of Paris to capture street life was Eugène Auger. But I want you to see his camera. He was using what's called a view camera, again, glass plates. This was about 44 pounds. And you had to use glass plates, you had to use a tripod. So how easy is that gonna be to capture street life? Now, one of his, by the way, what I wanted to mention about these gentlemen here is that they were often taking photographs for other purposes. So for instance, that image of the chimney sweeps was really probably just to have a basis for a painting. So photography was actually kind of secondary. Gee, you know, it helps, we don't have to draw things anymore, but you know, it's not really about the photography. Auger was similar. He created about 10,000 documents that were for architects, for set designs, for painters. One of the things he was concerned about was the modernization of Paris. Some of you may have heard of Haussmannization. The Baron Haussmann was the man that started really changing Paris by creating these beautiful boulevards like the Champs-Élysées and many others. But Auger was one of the people that said, well, let's record and preserve the old Paris because it's changing so fast. So these wonderful images capture architecture in Paris. And while he does include these people in them, frankly, the human beings are kind of secondary, right? He's interested in the architecture. Here, he does document and capture some of the people in Paris that would eventually disappear. Interestingly, this was a profession called a chiffonnier. And some of you, I think it's a little ironic because a chiffonnier was a rag picker. This was kind of the lowest like career. This is a very poor person that goes around and picks up little rags and leftovers to try to sell them. And ironically, it's the name of a very high-end piece of furniture in fancy homes, right? But he also captures this wonderful image of people at the Place de la Bastille looking at an eclipse with their little apparatus. So there is an interest here in people and what they're doing. And the last thing I'll say about Auger, which is really fascinating, we're going to see this throughout the talk, is he's really intrigued and documents storefronts and mannequins. And by the way, the surrealists loved this because, of course, dolls and mannequins represent these kind of, you know, kind of an otherness. You know, they're not humans, but they're still kind of there watching. And the surrealists like the whole idea of, you know, the conscious and the unconscious. So, but the point of this is it's very interesting to see how many of the photographers we're going to talk about today also looked at this. It's part of the streets. It's not humans, but it's kind of like human stand-ins. One of the terms that's useful to talk about when it comes to street photography comes from the poet and critic Charles Baudelaire. You know, Baudelaire in The Painter of Modern Life had coined or described a character called the flaneur. The flaneur, you've probably seen them in a lot of 19th century paintings. It's back then usually a male, because the men were the ones that could wander around. For women, it was not appropriate to be wandering around the streets. This was kind of the urban, contemporary, stylish man of leisure. He probably doesn't have a job, he doesn't need to. And his only job and purpose is to kind of take in the sights and sounds of the city. And the reason that becomes really interesting for street photography is because in a way that is what it is about. It's about wandering around and being that flaneur that's observing and capturing moments that otherwise would have just been unnoticed. So let's talk about this Hungarian artist that moved to France, and in fact is one of the first flaneurs that wound up getting a Leica camera, a highly portable camera that would help him wander around. In this wonderful image, he goes to the top of a staircase in Montmartre. Some of you know that that's a very hilly, very vertical part of Paris, where the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur is. And he gives us this image that is looking down. It has all these wonderful kind of architectural features, because of course you've got the railing, you've got the shadows of the railing, you've got verticals, you've got diagonals, and very importantly, you have this woman that's kind of rushing towards the stairs. I think this is so important because it really is the beginnings of capturing, again, this is not, you know, some important document. It's not like they're a celebrity or a politician. It's just some woman approaching a staircase. It might seem very banal, very ephemeral. That's the idea. So we need to talk about the Leica, discovered or really created by Oscar Barnack at the Ernst Lights Company. The name Leica comes from Lights Camera. It's a German company, and imagine how revolutionary this was. Look at how portable, look at how small. I mean, talk about a wonderful instrument if you want to be that flaneur that can run around. But the other thing about it, which was groundbreaking, you didn't need those big glass plates. They interestingly took the technology of cinema, 35 millimeter film that had already been in use in the movies, and started using it in the Leica. And for those of you that are not photographers, what this offers you is the opportunity to take lots of photographs and get what we call contact sheets. So these are kind of like the positive of the negative. And you can then decide, you know, I love this one, I hate that one, I do want to enlarge this one, this I'm gonna dump. Revolutionary. But the thing about Kurtesh is that not only is he running around, he's one of the first artists that really is felt to have turned photography into an art of its own. Because when you look at the aesthetics and kind of the incredible visuals of an image like this, and again, I call this talk walk on by. We're gonna see a lot of people walking by, riding by on bikes, driving around in convertibles. Look at this, the silhouettes of these men in the Place de la Concorde on a rainy day. It's absolutely magnificent. And this one, which he calls Carrefour, which by the way is not just a chain of French supermarkets, it means the crossroads. Look at what he does with this vantage point. You've got the biker, you've got the man walking, you've got, you know, the horse-drawn carriage, you've got another, I think it might be a motorcycle. So it talk about, you know, the intersection of all these people. So you're capturing movement, you're capturing motion. But again, this is that moment that no one else would have noticed if you hadn't captured it. And the thing about Kurtesh that's important is he taught a lot of the upcoming artists. So let's look at some of them. Oh, where's my cursor? Okay. He taught Henri Cartier-Bresson. an absolute giant of photography. And guess what? He's using a Leica. And Cartier-Bresson is the one that coined the term a decisive moment. And what he meant by a decisive moment is, look, painters can take weeks or months to create a scene. The photographer has to use speed and instinct and press the button right at the exact moment and capture something that would change imminently. So what I think is fascinating is, doesn't this look familiar? He's at the top of a staircase and he's waiting for that decisive moment. And again, you have kind of the architectural features of the staircase and the rail. And there goes by the bike and he gets it. And that's the decisive moment. And I just thought I would compare these because, again, talk about, teacher and pupil. And by the way, this is something that's been described as fishing. Go and find a wonderful location and then just wait for the decisive moment. So it's almost like he went, he thought this would be an interesting place, and he waited, and then the bike went by, and then he got it. Fishing. Maybe fishing again. This is another very famous Cartier-Bresson image behind the train station of Saint-Lazare. Again, captured the man the second he's in the air jumping over these puddles. And again, you've got kind of the static, stable architectural motifs of rails in contrast with the moving figure. But if you really look, there's even more going on here. I don't know how many of you see, there's happens to be a poster back there of a dancer that looks very much like this man. And of course, the reflections of both that dancer and the man as well. Really rich, wonderful stuff. Or this moment that Cartier-Bresson captures in Brussels. And it's really funny because, you have these two men standing by this kind of curtain or divider. And it's almost as if he's caught them looking at something. We have no idea what it is. But I hope you agree with me that it looks almost illicit. Almost like this one's kind of like, I'll let you know when they catch us, or I'll let you know if they're coming. And you really do wonder what this young man is looking at. I don't know if it's a circus. I don't know if it's a construction site. And what's funny is that it is in Brussels in the 30s, and one almost can't help but to think of the bowler hats in Magritte's paintings, right? Because here you are in Brussels and there's a Magritte painting. Ilse Bing, there she is with her Leica. She was nicknamed the Queen of the Leica. And this is a really iconic photograph of herself where she sat there with her Leica and she has a series of mirrors. And so there's several of these, but you can see her, from the front, from the side. And she's again running around. Now we're talking about a woman flaneur. And here she captures these men again. This is a very unremarkable moment, right? It's just kind of a guys reading by the Seine. But she also goes way up to the Eiffel Tower and captures these people, in what she calls a windy day. Or she goes into the Moulin Rouge. And what's funny about this is, she's rejoicing in the blurriness. Way back when, the last thing you wanted is blurry. You wanted people to sit still to get their portrait. And now we're seeing, I'm gonna run around with the Leica in the Moulin Rouge, and blurry is good. And these women are in the middle of motion and I'm capturing that action. And then finally, as far as Franz Brassai, we need to include, because he is kind of the genius that decided to photograph Paris by night. And so he really was a pioneer as far as the use of flash. Now, he is not into the Leica because he was not into, I'm gonna run around and take lots of snapshots and look at contact sheets. He said, I just wanna take what I wanna take. So I'm gonna use the bigger format, and I'm gonna publish this wonderful book, Paris at Night. Some of you that saw the talk on Creatures of the Night may remember these. Now, again, when you're working with a bigger camera and a flash, this is not as spontaneous as it looks. He's standing there with his camera, with his flash. These people know that he's there. And yet they have this feeling of spontaneity and this feeling that you're capturing these wonderful little moments in Paris bistros or of these lovers under a lamp. And the other thing, as we know, he did was capture a bit of kind of the Paris underground. And by the way, this, I think, will be very interesting when we talk about Diane Arbus, because you're talking about street photography, but by finding someone and actually letting them know, I'm gonna take your photograph. And you've got, Versailles went into brothels, he took photographs of prostitutes and streetwalkers, and in this case, he took this wonderful image of Madame Bijou, who's obviously a very kind of interesting offbeat character, full of jewels and a hat. Now let's cross the pond to the US. And I'm gonna start with the pictorialists like Alfred Stieglitz, because he was going out and trying to photograph some of the activity on the streets. Now, what's funny is this was considered somewhat portable. It's actually in a briefcase. It's a view camera, but it's half the size of some of the ones you had seen before. And carrying that around, he took these amazing photographs. Again, now we're back in the late 19th century of Fifth Avenue in a winter storm. And he says it took him over 3 hours in that blizzard to capture that precise moment on Fifth Avenue. These are in keeping with the pictorialist philosophy of trying to elevate photography to an art similar to painting. Between the blizzard and the snow and the fog, you get almost something that looks like an impressionist painting. But I like them because they do contribute to this idea of capturing moments that, they're beautiful, but they're not newsworthy, really, to look at some horses by a terminal. Bernice Abbott was an American that wound up in Paris from 1921 to 29. And guess what? She met Eugène Auger. And she really loved what he had been doing, trying to preserve the old Paris before it got too modern. And she actually got, she was given a project by the Works Progress Administration during the Depression to document changing New York. She wanted to do something like Auger had done, but in New York. Now, if you look, she goes back to these really huge, large format cameras, and that's because this is not about quick snapshots. She wants every detail. She wants to capture the incredible beauty. I find this funny because I lived at 30th and 3rd. And of course, this newsstand was long gone by the 90s. So I'm glad she preserved it. And what's funny is she looked at the dolls and mannequins in store windows. So isn't that funny? She met and knew Auger and liked his work, and there she goes with the mannequins in the store windows. If you're interested in her work, and thanks to my friend Harold, he flagged this wonderful book. This man, Douglas Levitt, 60 years after Bernice Abbott had documented the changing landscape of New York, went to the same exact locations 60 years later and took photographs from the same exact vantage point. And he calls it New York Changing from 1996. Isn't that incredible? So that barber shop, that restaurant is now, a hardware store, whatever you can see. And I suspect that now if we did it in 2021, it'd be something different again. Talk about our landscape after COVID, right? It's hard to think about street photography in the 1930s in the US without talking about Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans. Dorothea Lange had become an important studio photographer on Sutter Street in San Francisco, and she took portraits of kind of the upper class people of San Francisco. And it was in the Depression that she looked out her window and was seeing what the streets of the Depression look like. And she decided, you know what, I should be out there, enough with the fancy portraits. And this iconic image that she calls the White Angel Breadline is this group of men that are all lined up for a soup kitchen just down the street from her. What Dorothea Lange brings to this equation is an incredibly humane side. These are photographs really ultimately about human beings that are down and out, that are going through difficulties, and she's highly sympathetic towards their plight. And one of the things about Lange that's fascinating is I read that she admired what Mexican muralists used to do, which is that they might have a big crowd of people, but they would have like one unique character that you focus on. And if you look at these photographs on the streets of San Francisco, it's exactly that. You have this kind of crowd, but she hones in on this one key person you want to focus on. She, of course, went on, based on those photographs, to be sent off to look at the migrant workers. This is not really maybe street photography in the strict sense of the word, but I just wanted to acknowledge that what she's best known for are some of these amazing images of the very, very poor migrant workers. This one extremely well, we covered it in another talk. This one of these kind of Okies, so to speak, people that kind of were traveling and moving around. And of course, the irony is that there's a sign near them that says, next time, try the train and relax. Walker Evans, the other huge figure, and he basically was recording kind of the American vernacular for years. I love this image because it has that complete sense of spontaneity. Just, this is not a big event. This is just a bunch of men eating and drinking. And interestingly, it has that same sense of the reflection and the mannequins, except it's real men. He catches this one with a glass to his face, and this one in the middle of taking a bite. And it's got that sense of, spontaneity that would come to be known as street photography. In this one, I love this image. He captures these men as they're either loading or unloading this enormous sign. I don't know if it's for Broadway. I don't know if it's for a store, but it's kind of wonderful that it says damaged. This one is great. We're going to see a bunch of photographs of convertibles and people in them. I'll tell you my theory about that. And then this incredible series that he did. Now, what this brings to the table is the idea of candid photography. I'm doing portraits with people not knowing that I'm taking their portraits. He got this little Contax camera. It's so small, he could put it underneath his coat, and the little lens would peer out, from between his buttons. And he has a wire in his hand, and he sat on the New York City subway, and he just waited for the right moment and captured these people, usually probably after work. And there's something very Edward Hopper about this, right? There's cropping, You don't see the whole wagon. You don't see a lot of people. You just see this kind of lonely, isolated person. And guess who he often had next to him on the subway? Because he felt, it's going to be too obvious if I'm by myself. So he was friendly with Helen Levitt, and she sometimes rode on the subway next to him. And Helen Levitt was a big admirer of Walker Evans, and he was actually a very big admirer of her work. And as some of you may know, she's famous for the incredible photography she captured of children in particular playing on New York City streets, particularly in Harlem and the Lower East Side. Talk about a world that's disappeared, right? This was pre-television, pre-internet, pre-air conditioning. So these kids preferred to be outside. And there is something very decisive moment about this, because imagine capturing the boy, that moment. This one is looking for something. This one has his little bike right there within that mirror. And then these kids are kind of in the middle of a little dance. Really wonderful stuff. Now, she worked for decades. She actually even worked in color for many years after the 70s. And I wanted to acknowledge she didn't just shoot kids. This one is wonderful because remember when you used to have to carry like bottles of milk, glass bottles. And this reminds me of the little chimney sweeps, because in that one they had a pose. In this one, I assure you she's not posing. She's just, Helen captured her as she's walking with these bottles. This one is great. I'm hoping and assuming it was unposed. It almost creates this wonderful totem with these women up here looking that way, this man looking this way, and the little boy looking that way. It's a really incredible picture. The composition and just the way they're all kind of looking into somewhere off the frame in kind of a pondering way. It's amazing. Lisette Model was a Viennese, an Austrian woman. And we're starting with her when she was in Europe, but she is one of the many artists that crossed the pond when World War II arrived. And there she is. You may remember this from another lecture. Before coming to the US, she spent some time kind of documenting these fairly wealthy tourists in the French Riviera. And what's remarkable about these is that, again, they're these portraits of very particular kind of unique people. This one's got her doggy, and she's all dressed up in her hat. But again, because of cropping, she's removed all of the activity and everyone around them. And so what that creates is almost this sense of, they might be rich, they might be wealthy, they might be in sunny Nice, but there's something kind of lonely, something kind of isolated about them. And once Model comes to the US, she continues this. And in this case, never mind rich tourists in France, she's showing us these people that are kind of down and out in New York. But again, the cropping is key. And this idea of photographing people that no one else would have photographed. And by the way, keep that in mind, because her student at the new school was Diane Arbus. So guess where Diane Arbus learned that from? This idea of let's photograph the people that no one else is photographing. Guess what? Lisette Model looking at mannequins and storefronts. What did I tell you? It's really, you could do a whole lecture on that. And I love this series. Look what she does to capture kind of the crazy New York streets. Talk about cropping. I'm gonna use a really low vantage point. I'm gonna welcome all the blurring and the movement, and I'm just gonna give you running legs. And it's such a wonderful way because, again, humans are still protagonists, but it's not full humans. It's just running legs, blurry, photographed from below, cropped in such a way that they just capture that kind of craziness of New York. By the way, I'm looking forward to New York being back to this. We don't have as many running legs lately. Weegee is worth mentioning, even though you could argue he had a bit more of a purpose. This wasn't just random street photography. Some of you may know Weegee. That is a nickname. His name was Arthur Felig, originally Usher Felig. He became known for being kind of the night crawler. Some of you may have seen that movie. It's about being the first one at a scene that involved either a murder, a crash, something really quite salacious. And there he is in his car. He got himself a police radio. He got permission to have a police radio. So all night he's wandering around. And when they say, okay, at 104th and Broadway, someone just crashed, he run there. And so, of course, he was groundbreaking because he captured these really horrendous images. Sometimes he would even beat the police. And that was like thrilling to him because it's like, I get to have pictures even before anyone is here. This is this horrible stuff. Body of a girl killed after jumping out of a car in Park Avenue. Murder in Hell's Kitchen, my neighborhood right here. And then what's fun about this is he turns the camera not on the crime, but on all the kids and the families looking at it. And of course, this would be for like the Daily News and the rags. So there's something very kind of like, I'm gonna give you, alarming, kind of tabloid stuff. But it is very groundbreaking. And in a way, you could argue that this opened up photography to, it doesn't all have to be happy and pretty. It can also be really, really provocative and nasty. I wanted to throw this in because it's just a remarkable photograph. I mean, whenever I see it, I just cannot believe that many people would go to Coney Island on a hot day. Talk about an advertisement for air conditioning when it arrived. Because I mean, I've never seen anything like it, but Weegee, I guess, heard that Coney Island's gonna be packed with people. And if you look at his vantage point, he stood on a rail and basically yelled out to the people nearby, I'm taking your photograph. And there they are looking over. And so here's this basically July 4th weekend in Coney Island. And again, I think what's interesting about Weegee is that it's a lot of photography it's like worthy of sensationalism, right? I'm gonna give you the murders. I'm gonna give you like Coney Island that's absolutely packed. And now we are gonna start transitioning to what became really the official movement of street photography. And to do that, I'm gonna leave you with the idea that photography, for the most part, in the 30s and 40s, never mind Weegee, that was out there, but the photography that people were seeing in their living rooms was largely the photography of Esquire, of Life, of Vogue, of Harper's Bazaar. And by the way, there's an exhibition that just opened at the Jewish Museum called Modern Look, Photography and the American Magazine. And the point of this is that it had a very particular aesthetic. This iconic image by Alfred Eisenstadt of a couple kissing during, at the time that we beat the Japanese and they surrendered. There's no blurriness. It's a very romantic, kind of elevated moment. The composition is quite perfect. So, it might be this moment on the street, but the fact is it looks perfect. It's like the perfect picture. And that is about to change. And that's what I wanted to show you, because what broke new ground with Robert Frank and the artists that are coming is that their photography was no longer going to look like this. So Robert Frank, here you've got this young Jewish Swiss immigrant to the US, and he applies for a Guggenheim Fellowship, and it helped that Steichen, the curator at MoMA of photographs, was basically behind his application. And Robert Frank gets a fellowship to travel around the US, just like Jack Kerouac had done on the road, and basically document life in America in the 1950s. And so this is not about New York, this is about the US. And it's about traveling. He apparently traveled, if you can believe it, 10,000 miles. If you think about that, in the US to travel 10,000 miles, you went a lot of places. And he took about 27,000 photographs. What was controversial about his work is that of those 27,000 photographs, he chose 83 for his book, The Americans. And this is one of them. And so you're looking at this photograph of a trolley in New Orleans. This is in the 50s. And what you see is these white kids looking all happy in the window, and Black Americans in the back of the bus. So what was tough about this book is that he was kind of shedding light onto a side of America that was not so great. And I've got to remind you that the shows on TV were things like Ozzie and Harriet, and the photographs people had been seeing were like the ones in Life magazine. And the US was considered in the 50s the most prosperous, kind of like the standard of living was extremely high. It was kind of the land of Ford and GM and cars and prosperity. And he chose images that were tough. This is one of his most iconic photographs. And what's important about this one stylistically is you see the cropping is all off, right? So it's called Parade in Hoboken, but instead of taking a photograph of the parade, he's taken a photograph of these people looking at the parade from their windows. But not only is it not about the parade, it's about these women, and one of them is like in the shadows, and one of them is literally covered by the flag. And on top of it, the flag isn't even complete. So this is very, very unorthodox, let's put it this way, aesthetically and in terms of what you would have expected. Here you have a counter at a drugstore in Detroit. These are all men. These are all white men. And even though they're all in the drugstore having lunch or a malted, none of them are together really. Talk about pointing out kind of the sense of isolation, consumerism. It's all about, the 10-cent orange whip. It all looks very happy, but none of these men are actually that happy or together. And the women behind the counter, they're not only are they women, but they're African-American or Black. And he couldn't believe, you see, as a Swiss immigrant, that in the US in the 50s, Blacks in the South could not be at the counter, and yet they would take care of the babies. And what he does here, which involves shallow depth of field, is that this Black nanny is in perfect detail and contrast. And as you get to the baby, the white baby, and even beyond, it just becomes this kind of blurred whiteness, right? It's almost like... This book was so controversial that it got published in France in 1958, and then in 1959 in the US. Now, mind you, with time, it's come to be believed kind of the most groundbreaking and important books of photography in history, because it started this whole new way of photographing. And it's been compared by some to the famous Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, in terms of kind of seeing what the US is about, both good, bad, and ugly. In this photograph of this young woman, she's on an elevator in Miami. Imagine how wild. We think of Miami, oh, Miami, it's happy, it's palm trees and sun and fun. And you've got this sad, lonely. In fact, Jack Kerouac, who wrote the introduction for the book, said, that little old lonely elevator girl looking up, sighing in an elevator full of blurred demons. These people are blurred. They're just passing her by. She looks totally isolated and lonely. Look how grainy this is. And by the way, this woman, Sharon, saw herself at a gallery in San Francisco and said, oh my God, I can't believe that was me. That was me in that elevator. And for the anniversary of the Americans, she got her photograph taken in the same elevator. Mm. But this is the contrast I want you to think about. This is what photography was like. Look at the composition. There's no blurriness, it's perfect. And then there's kind of this, and by the way, this is again, this fun, romantic, exciting moment. And this is like sad and lonely and grim. But the other guy that's been called the father of street photography is William Klein. And again, also in the 50s, look at what he's doing. Strange cropping. Look how close he is to this woman. I mean, it's almost invasive. She's blurry. Her head is half cut off. This photograph here, again, pieces of people passing by. By the way, I had to look up what horn and heart art was because I made it too late to New York for the automats. Those were the automats. And he had his own book. A lot of these photos were rejected for an article because again, it was like, how dare you show New York this way? That's not what New York is about. And he was like, no, that is what New York is about. And he called New York the capital of anguish. And I think this image is really funny because again, he's very close up and these ladies are not saying welcome to New York. There's just something, again, very grim, very different about this kind of photography. He's got this image and these images of kids. And again, they're troubling, they're blurry. They're certainly, again, not the way you would want to portray New York on Life magazine. And I just thought I would compare these because I found myself thinking, I can't believe the uncanny difference of Helen Levitt's kids dancing and William Klein's only 15 years later. And I mean, it's almost to the point that the positions are the same, but the style, the grainy and the blurry and kind of the troubling is so different. So finally, and I hope we will continue in 2 weeks with these huge figures, but this marks the arrival really of the golden, I would say the golden era of street photography. The curator, John Sarkowski at MoMA, established or created a show that he called New Documents. And it included these 3 artists, Deanne Arbus, Lee Friedlander, and Gary Winogrand. And I'm actually gonna read you what he said about the exhibition. Why is it called New Documents? In the past decade, new generation of photographers has redirected the technique and aesthetic of documentary photography to more personal ends. Their aim has been not to reform life, but to know it. The world, in spite of its terrors, is approached as the ultimate source of wonder and fascination. no less precious for being irrational and incoherent. So in a way, almost saying they're capturing life as it is. It's not all pretty. And Diane Arbus, and by the way, if you want to impress friends, well, if you want to sound obnoxious, tell them it's not Diane, it's Deanne. But Deanne, as you know, is one of the most important photographers ever and of the 20th century. And one of the reasons she is street photography is she wandered around in places like Central Park and captured the portraits of people that, again, otherwise probably wouldn't have been photographed. One of the things she's known for is photographing people that were probably not the Life magazine person, unusual, on the fringes, strange, provocative, all of the above. Here's an image of what she calls a very thin man in Central Park. It's everything she's about. This is actually kind of an early photograph for her. Look at his legs. And she thinks about these, and by the way, she would approach people and become friendly and conversant with them, and then use her Rolleiflex camera to capture them. She started using a Nikon camera, but then she moved to a Rolleiflex. A Rolleiflex camera is a medium format that would capture a lot of the detail. And also that camera is a camera that you look down towards, so that once she knows who she's going to take and she's got kind of the position ready, she can engage with them. You're not hiding behind a camera. This is one of her most important images, boy with a toy hand grenade. So imagine, you know, in the park, you're supposed to see happy children playing, and instead she captures this boy looking very scary, very tense, very frightening, holding a grenade, a toy grenade on one hand, and kind of with this claw on the other. And the thing she does, you see, is she juxtaposes him. She puts him in front of these trees. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. Look at those trees and look at his legs. And look at this happy little family in the background. So it's almost like this is supposed to be what it's like to be with kids in New York, but I'm giving you troubled boy. But you see, with the contact sheets, Arbus is famous for having taken lots of pictures of these sitters. And this boy was perfectly happy, a perfectly cute little boy. She could have chosen this, but she doesn't. She chooses, you know, that. So her sitters are not only sometimes definitely unusual or different, but even when they're not, she chooses to give us unusual and different. And I just had to compare them because I think it's kind of remarkable that you've got Thin Man in Central Park in 61, and then this boy again in front of trees in 62. Things I noticed. Or she takes a photograph of this young family in Brooklyn. And you know, you look at the family and you're like, okay, yeah, it's a family. And then you realize that this little boy, again, is not the family you would have seen on an advertisement in Life magazine. And she actually, I don't know, sometimes she calls her pictures something that in today's day sounds really not appropriate. Like a young family in Brooklyn going for a Sunday outing. Their baby is named Dawn. Their son is retarded. It sounds really callous, right? Because it's not like their baby is named Dawn and their son is Richie. It's like their baby is named Dawn and their son is retarded. And now we wouldn't even use the word retarded. But the point about this is that in this exhibition, New Documents, Diane Arbus was giving you photographs of the people that no one else would have photographed. I mean, who in the world is photographing a family with this little boy? Or talk about, you know, patriotic young man with a flag. So yeah, it's like, oh, good, he's a patriotic young man. Does he look like someone you would have seen in an advertisement? I mean, he's, as someone would say, a face that only a mom would love, or I don't know what the expression is. He's not the most attractive young man. And she's doing this purposely. She's kind of being, she was accused of being exploitative, of objectifying her sitters, but otherwise she was also considered someone that photographed the people that no one else was. And I wanted to show you this because I do believe that what she was doing does have a lineage that goes back to someone like a Brassai and Madame Bijou, or her teacher at the New School, Lisette Model, and then her own. Oh my goodness. Let's see, it's 7 p.m. If we don't get to it, I want to do justice to these artists. We'll talk briefly about them, and then in 2 weeks we'll go back and we'll focus on them a bit more. The other two people at that exhibition, Lee Friedlander is again a flaneur in the city. His images are quite distinct. He's very interested in signs, interested in reflection, interested in shadows, and even interested in the idea of I'm part of the photograph. So that is Lee Friedlander taking a picture of a window behind which is a TV. So you've got a TV, you've got him, and you've got what's behind him. Very much almost like bringing to light the craziness of the city and the illusion that exists of what we see at every given moment. We see images that are in front of us, reflected, behind us, and everything in between. He had a whole series of televisions, by the way. Again, this is very Lee Friedlander because the man is inside the ice cream parlor. The woman maybe is inside, maybe outside. You almost don't know because she might just be a reflection. But then again, you kind of see his reflection there. So a lot of trickery and a lot of wonderful kind of questioning perception. This is one of his most iconic images. You've got a man coming in through a revolving door, a woman exiting, and guess what? Back there, way back there, a reflection of a man coming towards all of this. He really likes to kind of question, make you think of what exactly am I looking at? Once again. And this very iconic image, he's taking a picture of the back of this woman very, very close up, almost in an invasive way. Imagine it's almost like he's stalking her like a paparazzi. And by doing that, you see his own shadow on top of her. And so this is really wonderful because it's almost the idea of it's street photography, it's spontaneous. And by the way, I'm in it, I'm part of this. And I am, in a way, a kind of a stalker. I'm stealing people's images, I'm going around and I'm capturing them. And guess what? He also looked at mannequins and reflections. And last but not least, and I'm cognizant that it's 7:03, we're gonna close with Gary Winogrand. I think he's one of my favorites of this particular moment. This is all what we had talked about as street photography. It's spontaneous, it's not documentary. He probably couldn't have done this with some big camera because he's right up against, I mean, where is he? It sounds like he's like practically on the trunk of this car. We had seen this one before. I mean, talk about being right up against this car, and this woman is like, what are you doing? And then this one I love because it's at the World's Fair. And again, humans are the protagonists. There's something very spontaneous. This is not really photojournalism of, you know, some higher kind of agenda. here I wanted to say, you know, it captures the mystery and awe of streets. Human beings are protagonists, spontaneous, a result of advances in camera technology, and does not have really kind of a bigger documentary mission. Here, when he's out in LA, it's like these ladies, these women are all kind of looking great, walking down, I believe it's either Sunset or Hollywood Boulevard, and yet you've got this man totally down and out here. So the contrast and the light is just absolutely remarkable. And again, it has that kind of decisive moment, right? It's this moment when these women are going by this man. So in summary, I hope you enjoyed this journey through kind of the years leading up to this golden movement. One of the things I would say is that these decisive moments often do have human beings in motion. I called the talk Walk On By, but we've seen people walking by, biking by, driving by. In fact, I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of them are in convertibles. And I gave some thought to that. And I think it has to do with the fact that, you know, if people are inside a car, all you're going to see is the car. So that's not so exciting. When they're in convertibles, it's less about the car and more about, you know, what are these people or monkey doing? The other thing I hope you noticed is that there's very often some very unique vantage points, whether it's, you know, let's look at the running legs of New York, or the people down below on Coney Island, or down underneath these stairs. And before we go to questions, I just want to promote the talk in 2 weeks, because street photography is so extensive. I realized that this was very kind of Franco-American, and I wanted to give you kind of the basics of this movement, but we're going to go beyond the 60s into the 70s, 80s, and even through to today. And I want to go abroad. We're going to go look at photography in Turkey, in the UK, in Japan, in Mexico, and elsewhere, and acknowledge that many of you and many people are still doing street photography today. And if you enjoyed this talk, you can write a review on Yelp. I'll send all of this to you later. You can donate to my GoFundMe page, and hopefully someday soon you can join me for a live art gallery tour. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and let's see if you have. I'll. By the way, if you, I don't know if you know how to raise your hand on the chat, or is it in participants? Or you can raise your physical hand. We can open this up to questions. See, you guys can raise your hand and I will see that on the participants. Karen, let's see. I'm asking you to unmute.
Hi there. Oh, this was awesome. It was really interesting. And I like that you're starting to revisit some of the photographers that you've talked about before, starting to recognize them. One of the things that I found really interesting is the luck. It's almost like you have to have luck if you want to get these good shots. You know, it's not like Leonardo da Vinci needed to get lucky, or Picasso needed to get lucky. But if you're like a street photographer and you want to get that decisive moment, there is, I think, even though they go out fishing, to a certain extent, you are dependent on getting lucky and getting the right scene at the right time. So I thought that was really interesting that luck plays such a big part in this.
Yeah, no, it's a great comment. Because you're right, you can put yourself in situations that might lead to that, but there is definitely that element of chance. And by the way, part of why the Surrealists liked Cartier-Bresson is because surrealists really loved this idea of like chance and art that's just created almost by accident. So that was actually something they really loved. Thank you for that comment. I'm gonna mute you. Okay, let's see. I see a hand here. Hi, Mel. Mel, is it Mel?
Hello,
Hi,
how are you?
how are you?
I'm good. It's a very basic question. The presentation was phenomenal. I loved it, but I missed the first 30 minutes. Are you gonna record, is it recorded to be sent out later?
I absolutely will, and you'll have
Excellent.
it by tomorrow. So I'm glad
Excellent.
you
I'm so
enjoyed it.
sad. I'm so sorry I missed the first
That's-
half. I was like,
that's
oh no.
That's quite all right.
This
Thank
was
you,
great. Can't wait for the
Jessica.
2 weeks.
Thank you. Let's see. Let's see. Shaya, I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I never really thought about luck, but yes, this is fabulous talk, and I was lucky to find you. Thanks to Meryl. But I think there's also something that, you know, in my experience, it has to do with synchronicity. And I'm always stunned at the gifts that open themselves up sometimes when I'm making images, but sometimes I don't even realize it till later, you know, the people coming and going in the image and the characters that just materialize. And so I think there's luck, but there's also something ineffable and magical about it, at least in my experience. And it may just be where I choose to make these photographs because it's a colorful place and you get interesting characters. But, you know, I really think there's like something that can't just be put into words or even discussed as only luck.
Right, right. No,
Because
that's a great point.
the sensibility of the photographer often comes through in street photography. You see such a difference that it's not just, oh, here's one lucky moment, here's the next, and they look sort of alike. So I wanted to throw that in.
No, that's an excellent point. It's the luck might bring a certain moment that's interesting, but the sensibility and talent of the photographer is a huge part of how they ultimately capture it. So absolutely right. Thank you for that.
I mean, even just like what you choose to see, like Arbus. How would it be? It's lucky, but it's also that she has that discriminating awareness that she picks up on something or sees the potential in it.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And by the way, Arbus had initially gone to Lisette Model, her teacher, and said, I don't know what to photograph. Like, I don't know, what is it? And initially she said, I think I want to photograph evil. But what she actually then clarified, evil didn't mean truly evil. It meant I wanted to photograph what no one else is photographing. You know, those people that are, again, it's not what we see. And so you're right, that was a very conscious choice on her part. That's not about luck. It's about really directing where she wants to take her photography. So thanks for that. Let's see. I'm very bad at this part of, let me see if there's little hands raised. Or physical hands, anyone? Oh, hold on. Let's see. I see a hand. Susie. I don't know why I can't unmute you. Oh, there.
Okay, thanks. Just something I noticed is that so many of the photographers lived until their 90s. Not all of them, but a great number of them seem to have. Just curious
No, I love that comment. You know, maybe we should all be doing photography. It's fascinating because there are photographers I've noticed that live to their 90s. And in the case of some of them, we didn't cover her today, for example, but you see their evolution all the way from styles like pictorialism of the early 20th century, like Imogen Cunningham. And she starts out with, you know, that whole idea of like, let's elevate this to look like a painting. And then she gets into like straight photography that's all about crispness and detail. So you actually see their career be affected and change, you know, with the movements of the time. And so it is remarkable when you see that some of them lived practically a whole century of photography. And in the case of Helen Levitt, you know, we didn't cover it today, but she moves into color photography. So all those wonderful